Welcome to section 7, and in this section we're going to take a look at Redux, which is going to provide the state management for our application. And in this section, of course, we're going to take a look at Redux. But Redux isn't just for React, it's for any type of application, Angular, plain JavaScript, Vue, whatever kind of application you're creating, you can add Redux to it. It's a JavaScript library for managing states in an application. So we're also going to add React Redux, which allows us to integrate Redux into our application, and it makes it very easy for us to go and get the states that we're storing inside Redux and make use of it in our app. In order to keep us within best practices for using Redux and ensure that we can create a very scalable, functional application, we're going to make use of Redux Toolkit to help us write our Redux code. If you've never seen this before, it's an excellent tool. And we're also going to take a look at Redux DevTools to help us troubleshoot problems in our application. And I love the Redux DevTools, they are quite excellent. So just to cover what Redux actually is, well, it's a store for our application. It's kind of like a, I don't want to say database, but it is a place where we can store our application states in a central location and then access it from anywhere else in our application. There's a couple of rules around it. There's only one store per application, but each store can have many reducers or slices of states. Now, when we add Redux into our application, we're going to add a provider. Now, we've already created our own provider in React context, and we use that provider to provide the state to our application. Redux does the same thing, but it's more powerful and it's more scalable. And whilst in a small app we could get away with using React context, when our app becomes more complicated, there's a time where we'll come to need something a bit more powerful like Redux. Now, I'm not saying our app is ever going to get to that stage where we need to use Redux, and we could use the React context for everything that we're doing in this application. But it would make our code a bit more cumbersome, and by using Redux, we can move a lot of our logic outside of our application into Redux and really clean up the components and make them as small and lightweight and reusable as possible. So we're going to use a React Redux provider. That's one of the things we get from React Redux. It allows us to provide our Redux store to our application, and just as we've seen before, this allows all of our components to consume that state. Now, when we use the Redux state management system, then we're going to have a store, and we provide that store to our app. Now, our app has components that state gets passed to, and if we want to update the state, if we want to make a change to the states that's inside our store, then we use actions. We dispatch these actions to our reducers, and our reducers, we can have many of these. We can, for example, we could have a catalog reducer and a basket reducer, and those are the reducers that we'll be creating. And then we go and update our store, which is provided to our app, which then updates any and re-renders any components. And again, if we want to update the state, then we dispatch an action to our reducers, which update the store, and so on and so forth. And that's the flow of what we're doing here. It's all one way. So if we want to make a change to a state in the store, then we have to dispatch an action to that store. Now, our store is going to have reducers, and the reducer is really just a function. But a reducer function takes the current state, whatever's in our store, and an action, and then it returns a new state result. That's what we're doing when we dispatch an action and we update the store. We're creating a new state result that then gets passed down to our app and then the components. So just a few best practices. There are many when it comes to Redux with best practices. The first and most important one is that we're not allowed to mutate state inside our Redux store. We have to create new states and then replace the existing state with that state. Our reducers must not have side effects. They cannot go out and get some data from the API and then update the states based on that data. They must not have side effects. They have to use what's referred to as pure functions. Functions that do not have side effects. They cannot have non-serializable values in the state or our actions. That means we cannot create class instances or use functions inside our state. and we can only have one store per application. Now, in order to help us stick to these Redux best practices, we're going to be using something called Redux Toolkit, and this simplifies our Redux code. Now, unlike Redux itself, the Redux Toolkit is opinionated. It has set ways that we need to do stuff, and it does force us to stick to the best practices, even if we try not to. It has good defaults for store setup as well, and it really makes the setting up of our store very easy, and it has the most commonly used Redux add-ons built in. Now, when it comes to using things like Redux DevTools or some middleware that we're going to add to Redux soon so that we can make asynchronous requests from our store, then we need to add on something to Redux, but Redux Toolkit comes with this built in. And one of the big complaints about using Redux is the amount of boilerplate code that we need to write to get it working. And Redux Toolkit helps us create Redux code to best practice with less boilerplate. And let's take a look at the before and after for this lesson before we get started. So in this before and after, there isn't really much of a before and after in this case, because we're going to take our existing functionality and we're going to move it into a Redux store. So as far as the functionality that we have at the end of this section, well, it's going to be roughly the same as we have now. There are some improvements though. As we use Redux Store, we're going to be able to effectively save our products in our store. So when it comes to loading an existing product that we already have, then we're not going to go out and get it from our API. It's already going to be available. So we can just go and load the already existing product into our view for a detailed view of a product. And of course, if we go back to the catalog, we don't need to go out and load the catalog again as we have been doing because we've already got it. So that's the one user interface improvement we're going to make here. But this section is about Redux, and we are going to move our code into Redux, and let's take a look following this at how we do that.